First repeat and then straight through, so it is. So this one's quite slow if you remember.
It's gonna fall.
Oh, your stance quite narrow, isn't it? Do you want to take the
Don't mind.
keep the divs up, put your divider maybe up, and then that could be your back. I've done this before. I
certainly
I
have.
do have clothes pegs in my case if we need them. So
Thank you.
so it's quite slow. These are quavers. Ba, 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 2 and 3. God, if I'm singing through that, that's bad, isn't it? Okay, so I have 2 quavers. Is it 8 o'clock yet? That's just 8 o'clock. 1, 2, 3, and.
One, two, two, one, 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 two, two, one, two.
2, 2, 2, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2, 2, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. One, two, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. Don't ask me to go above 3. Just write it down and I'll...
Yeah, sorry, I'll take them. I don't know. I think I do need to see somebody about OCD. Well, we just keep, because it's kind of quiet, well, we keep them, it's not even quarter past yet. Just keep them slow and...
Yeah, until they go to an end. Until it gets half past. Start
So,
shooting up.
she moved through the fair and then hallelujah?
Yeah.
She moved through the fair and then hallelujah?
And just move on the...
Yeah, so this one's the weird one, sorry. You see the arrows? Just
Hold the note.
You have to
just hold
concentrate.
that note.
And move
Yeah,
on the...
I'll try my best.
And you doing twice through or...
I think 3 times.
Yeah, for black. Do you want some milk?
Sorry.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much.
Black, milk.
Milky, please.
Do you want milk?
Black.
Black.
Thank you.
We're doing move to her.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so just
just-
drone, just
yeah.
hold that lovely E all the way through. 1, 2, 3. Is Sinead O'Connor sang that? Did she?
She.
Sounds like sort of drone
She's got a lovely voice for all those kind of things as well.
for all her.
Shall we start to liven it up a wee tiny bit, maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe Hallelujah. Just it's kind of like a everybody knows this one. Yeah, as a bridge to a more modern time. So Jenny. Is that okay? So do you want to count it in, sure?
One,
Some coffee. The coffee's just there behind us, actually. Katrina left it there. Just a very quick. Cheers. Thank you very much. Just about got through that one.
Cheers, thank you.
Oh, lovely, lovely, lovely. Thank you, superb. Cheers. So,
what should we do next?
let's have a wee think about it.
It's an interesting study. If you said a little critical care decisions, the option of coffee or string quartet music, or all choose coffee.
Oh gosh, I know.
It's actually really nice, that coffee. I wasn't expecting it to be so nice.
Just about right.
When you go to these things,
Yes,
they're
I think
not
so. I think we need to line that up a bit, don't we? Well, we do one of the days.
Yeah.
Because we all know them all.
Yeah.
And keep it simple. Stupid. Well, it's not like you're both now, so you can't do it.
I'm dying to see
one,
but
no
I
repeats.
know my friend. She's
I think all
in
of them,
Do them
just
all?
because
She's only started
Okay.
though last year.
What time are you here?
Come on.
Oh, really?
Nina Tatterkois.
all our beats.
I know the name.
Use the full.
Do you know Nina?
I don't know if I know her, but the name rings a bell.
I couldn't forget that one.
It's going to take one first movement.
Yeah.
They've won first movement, all the repeats.
We'll do all the repeats because we've still got 40 minutes
So
to
there's
do.
the first
so,
page is repeated, and then the second page repeated.
Yeah, first page repeated and then second page repeated. I'll give you time to do the page turn because I don't have one.
So, okay, and that's it, then we're stopping.
So yeah, repeat.
Should we do the second movement just to keep going?
But sure, we'll stop at the end of the first one.
You want to?
Anyway, yeah. Take a break and take a drink of coffee and then go again.
Get our priorities right.
Yeah, that sounds like a good tempo. I think that's a good tempo. Yeah.
Just a shade
Some
below
of the
what
recordings
we
are so fast.
Oh yeah, play this really
did.
fast.
Do you group those?
Into fours.
Okay.
Into beats. Yeah.
Good luck.
He's just carry on.
This is for you too. Look here.
By that speed. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4.
when you're doing your pizzicato, and I was trying to keep up my fingers tripping over
I
each
know
other.
I was trying to listen to the tune and go,
I
right,
think,
that's getting too fast for them.
Yeah, I think the key is just steadier if we're thinking we're rushing, everything's rushing. So it is. So it just as a default, just slow down.
Pull back,
Just
yeah.
hold back because we're all arriving early. I think.
Do you want to second one?
Yeah. I think we just should because we've got still half an hour. Okay. And we've played all the good stuff.
We'll just do straight through, or?
Let's do first repeat. Just the first repeat, which is at the end of our 29, 30, 31.
Oh, I see it, I've got it.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Just nice and steady.
So 2, 3, and. So Dave number 2, second movement, Allegro de Molto.
Sabotage by the Beastie Boys.
No,
That's my 5-year-old's favourite song. Even the explicit bit. But he doesn't really know what he's saying. You keep well.
yeah, dude.
I can't think of that one. I can imagine what it's like.
It's all pro bono. Charles, look at this.
Oh, right, first thing.
You have to think about it.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
You're very new. Here, have you been kind of
No, definitely not. There's usually wine.
I was just thinking about you last night, the clinical directors. Just caught up on this really awful thing. You should watch it, yeah, it was like corruption and like it was outrageous. I was like saying, I can't imagine it was very
No,
still doing all your admin and clinical. See me in video. Here, Steve. Steve video.
Yes, thankfully.
Moved in there. I don't know if it was a video on a camera. I didn't look. See, I always get
Because
ready.
I was kind of if they videoed any of the other ones.
So are the repeats from this?
Yes, both repeats.
Both repeats.
take this one fairly steady too.
Steady. So very steady for that end of the quartet.
I'm trying to listen.
No, I know, but just kick him. I've been shouting.
Not too high, is
I've
it?
been shouting, but he hasn't heard me. I'm like, come on, bro. Like, I'm conducting this road.
That's the thing about playing in a quartet. You have to start being really like, don't you, with your head and your breathing.
It's almost like you should have them up here so they're all like eye line.
Yeah.
Have you?
Allegro de Molto.
This is from
Second.
number 2.
Yeah.
I don't know this, but it looks like it's all
Really
papers.
steady.
Did we play this in the house though? Didn't we? We did.
I
We
think we
played
did,
this.
yeah.
Played it. So the key to this is steady. Really, really steady.
So me and you have to stay together.
Starts rushing.
Yeah. Reset it. Reset it each repeat. John, both repeats. Both repeats. Okay. And if it starts rushing, just look up and I'll start conducting with my scroll. Okay.
I'm happy to keep it. Okay. I'm almost worried that I'm a bit behind.
No, you're okay. You're okay.
Happy enough? Okay. Good luck. 1, 2, 3, 4. Excellent. Sounds great. Sounds great. Lovely. You lie well.
Yes.
That's why we probably do all the Irish stuff.
I think the coffee helped.
Yeah, the coffee did help. The coffee got us faster.
Thank you very much.
What's the plan? Another 5 minutes and then.
I think it's kind of gone quiet again. We might be able to want to do like the Atlantic Swell again.
What about Palladio? We're keeping that for.
We haven't rehearsed it.
Have we
And
not?
it's a funny one. It has funny
What
bits.
about
in it.
Irish Sherry? Oh, I was looking forward to that. Yeah, I'll do it then.
Everybody practiced it, have it?
Did, but I'd rather not play it.
What about page 25, Pavan, or 24, Chanson de Matin?
Yeah.
25, Pavan.
What is it again?
Page
Oh,
25.
well, mine's out of it.
Guys, thanks for coming. Haven't seen you. It's brilliant. Job. You know to stop about
Between us, tell us 6 minutes to.
Yep, we've got.
Did we practice this?
What are we doing? Chance on the mat.
Did we practice that? They've all done. Is that big thing?
Chanson de Matin, page 24.
Apologies in advance, you don't remember this one. So.
When you start this. Yeah, that's about 3.
What are we doing?
1, 2.
Or 5. Another 5. Another 6 minutes. One quick one then.
More tune then?
Will we play a fast one? That's nice. Let's play 21, page 21. Right, page
Prelude from
prelude from today.
Yeah, I will. They're going to go quiet.
We have 1 minute each, 2 minutes. That's a bit louder, a bit faster, and then 4 minutes. Lovely. Okay. Happy?
We're doing 21.
Prelude from today.
Okay.
Page 21. Next time.
Hi, Chris.
Here we go.
Better concentrate.
1, 2, 3. Perfect. 1 minute extra of silence. Right, that'll do us. Let's go. That's a nice way to finish it, actually. Thank you very much, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you very much. 90 seconds. Sorry, my watch is not tested.
Sorry, I'm on internet time here, so
Okay. Let's see.
that's what we're going to do.
Want to try it? Canon?
I'll tell you what,
I'm just thinking in case. What do you think?
well, you've 60 seconds. Can you do something? If not,
Save time and stay connected to your
Page 13, trumpet
Well, that
voluntary.
is bad not having any music here. What's happening?
we're about to do something. Yeah, away you go.
Trumpet voluntary, page 13. Page 13. Is that trumpet on? That's okay. Plus, okay. Page 13, trumpet voluntary. It's the same. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Repeat.
Good morning. I'm Rob McSweeney, and you're all very welcome to the Critical Care Reviews meeting for 2018. It's a landmark day today in intensive care medicine. Pivotal trials like Adrenal only occur 2 or 3 times per decade. And we're extremely honoured to welcome Bala Venkatesh and 5 of the Adrenal trial investigators to Belfast. We're honoured and humbled that they would choose our little meeting on the other side of the world to announce the results of their trial. Today is, of course, not just about Adrenal. We have a number of other fantastic trials to discuss. Today, we have the chief investigators here. Please do take the time to interact with them and ask them the questions that you would like to know so you can understand their trials better. We're live streaming across the world. If you're watching anywhere out there, you're very welcome. Please do tweet to us as well, #CCR18. We're not using Twitter handled names, so you won't need to search for anyone. Just use the hashtag. We have a number of sponsors that I have to mention, without whom today wouldn't be possible. For the first time, we have a main meeting sponsor, Armstrong Medical, a local company from the North Coast. I'm delighted to welcome Nigel and his team here. We also have a number of very loyal sponsors, and our premium sponsors, Cardiac Services, Gilead, Draeger, Sword, Hamilton, and Nikiso. The meeting's been running now for 6 years, and for 5 of those years, Chris Waring, our event manager, has been hugely helpful, as has Mike Korish and his AV team. 3 of my friends have helped me this year, Chris Nutt, LJ Mottram, and Katrina Kelly. They've worked tirelessly for the last number of months getting this production ready today. Hopefully you all have a copy of your book. 4 of my colleagues helped me write this. Again, Chris Nutt, Chris Gowers, Dominic Traynor, and Peter McGuigan. The book is not for profit. It's available, it will be shortly as soon as I press go. It'll be available online for free. We critique, summarize, and put in context the best trials of the year. So please do disseminate it widely. CCR is entirely not for profit. So it's great pleasure, and I have great pride in the fact that it's now reached the level that it's at. And for that, I must thank the trialists and the critical care community in general for buying in. We're part of this not-for-profit altruistic ethos, which is personified by SMAC and my friends in Sydney and Melbourne who head that. Next year, we move to 2 days, Thursday the 17th and Friday the 18th of January. I do hope you'll be able to join us then. Thank you very much once again for joining us on this, a landmark day, hopefully a great day.
Thank you, Rob. This meeting would not be possible without the massive organisational skills and complete machine that is Rob McSweeney. Could I say thank you to the string quartet? They were utterly fantastic. I hope they're still here to hear my thank yous. As you know, we are live streaming this session. Can you make sure that your phones are on silent, but don't turn them off, because you need to tweet. The hashtag is #CCR18 or #Adrenal. Please, please do not try and stream this yourself. You will crash the Wi-Fi. This will make Dr. McSweeney very cross. We will find you. We will sort you out. Please fill in your feedback forms as you're going along, because we can make this meeting better by knowing what you want from it. So, our speakers, we have an illustrious crowd. Every one of them is a professor. I'm lowering the IQ by standing up here, the average IQ. So, our first speaker will be Professor Bala Venkatesh, who is the lead investigator for the Adrenal study. He's a professor at the University of Queensland and the George Institute, and a past president of the College of Intensive Care Medicine in Australia. We have Cathy Rowan. I don't think she needs much introduction. There can't be anybody in the audience who doesn't know Cathy. Simon Finfer, likewise professor from the North Shore Hospital and the George Institute in Australia. Anders Perner, who's from Copenhagen. He's the chair of the Scandinavian Critical Care Trials Group. And on the end, one of our newest professors of intensive care in the UK, Tony Gordon, And I knew him when he was a trainee. It's a bit like policemen. You know, they're starting to look very young these days. So, oh, Karen. Have I introduced you, Karen? No, Karen is a professor from Graz in Austria. And she's the unusual thing, a combination of an intensivist and endocrinologist, and is deeply interested in vitamin D. The other people are our panel who are going to grill Professor Venkatesh on his results. My history with steroids goes all the way back to the 30 milligrams per kilogram methylprednisolone shock pack. I never believed in that at the time, and I'm kind of hoping that my prejudice against steroids are about to be reinforced. Professor Venkatesh.
Thank you, Anna. And Rob, thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here and to report the Adrenal trial results in Belfast. And thank you for giving us the time, for the wonderful hospitality, the great venue, beautiful city, terrific music. It's also particularly fitting that we report the results here because of the huge contribution the UK made to the trial. The Adrenal trial is a randomized controlled trial of corticosteroids and septic shock. And on behalf of the management committee of the Adrenal trial, the site investigators, the clinical trials group of ANZICS, and the George Institute for Global Health, it's my privilege to report the results of the trial here today. Now, sepsis is a major global health issue, and people realize that. And the mortality rates in people who are hospitalized with severe sepsis and septic shock still approaches somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on which part of the world you live in. We don't have a proven pharmacological cure for septic shock, apart from antibiotics, fluids, pressors, and supportive intensive care. And so the search for adjunct treatments in septic shock continues. And one such treatment that's been looked at for many, many years is corticosteroids. The first reported trial of steroids in sepsis was way back in the 50s, and the first reported trial of steroids in the treatment of septic shock was in 1976, the Schumer's trial. The initial focus was always on high-dose corticosteroids, and as Anna mentioned before, 2 large trials reported in the New England in the 80s, looking at 30 milligrams per kilo of methylprednisolone, reported an increase in adverse outcomes in the group treated with steroids. Following these 2 trials, there was a reduction in the enthusiasm for using steroids in these patients, till the report in the mid-90s, which said that not high-dose steroids, but if you used a supraphysiological or a low-dose corticosteroids, then there certainly was an improved pressor responsiveness in the patients treated with steroids and a trend towards improved mortality. Around the same time, another pathophysiological concept gathered momentum, which is the concept of relative adrenal insufficiency. And I guess the combination of these 2 reports reignited the interest in the use of steroids in septic shock and prompted 2 randomized controlled trials. And I'm sure you're all familiar with these 2 trials. The first one is the Anand trial in 2002, and the second was the Corticus trial in 2008. The results from these 2 trials generated a lot of debate. The Anand trial reported an improved survival in the group who were deemed to be adrenally insufficient, or what they call the non-responders, and improved survival in the corticosteroid group, whilst the Corticus trial, in fact, did not show that difference. There was no difference in outcome on the intention to treat analyses in either of these 2 trials. Both trials lacked the statistical power to detect a plausible difference in mortality. In both trials, nearly a quarter of the patients received etomidate, and how that was a confounder in the analysis of the results was obviously debated. The Anand trial used fludrocortisone, whilst the Corticus didn't. There were differences in the study population between these 2 trials. The Anand trial was predominantly a medical sepsis cohort, Walser-Corticus was a surgical sepsis. And there were concerns about equipoise issues in the Corticus trial, which is one of the factors which led to the premature cessation of the trial. And the Corticus trial reported an increase in adverse effects with steroids, whilst the Anand trial didn't. Nevertheless, following the second trial, following the Corticus trial, the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines, they downgraded the recommendations for corticosteroids, giving it a weak recommendation. And there was an attempt to address this question in a subsequent 2x2 factorial design study, which was reported by Anand in 2010, combining insulin and also looking at hydrocortisone and fludrocortisone, and essentially concluded that the addition of oral fludrocortisone did not result in an improvement in mortality in patients with septic shock. So not surprisingly, with the massive information, with conflicting results, there was substantial global uncertainty in the minds of clinicians, and it resulted in marked variability in practice. So it's really against this background of uncertainty and the importance of this question that we in Australia decided to undertake the Adrenal trial. What was required was, in fact, a large-scale trial to answer this question, which we had the capacity to do, as the CTG had shown evidence of large-scale trials prior to this. We were an etomidate-free environment in Australia. There was sufficient equipoise amongst the clinicians, which we established in a survey, in a postal survey, in an electronic survey prior to the study. And so we decided to do the Adrenal. The list of the management committee is there on the screen that you can see, comprising of members from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Denmark, and Saudi Arabia. The study was sponsored by the George Institute for Global Health, which is affiliated with the University of New South Wales, and endorsed by the ANZICS Clinical Trials Group. The funding for the study was principally from the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, top-up funding from the Health Research Council of New Zealand, and there was indirect funding support from NIHR in the UK. The aim of the study was to determine whether hydrocortisone treatment reduces mortality in patients admitted to an ICU with septic shock. And the hypothesis being that hydrocortisone as compared to placebo will reduce day and night mortality in these patients. The trial design, it was an investigator-initiated, pragmatic, double-blind, parallel group randomized controlled trial conducted in 5 countries as listed. The inclusion criteria were patients who were 18 years of age or above with proven or a strong suspicion of infection, who fulfilled 2 or more SIRS criteria, who had shock requiring pressors for a minimum of 4 hours and continuing up to the time of randomization, and who were also requiring mechanical ventilation. So we chose a group of patients who had a requirement for vital organ support and who had a high risk of death. The exclusion criteria for the trial were if patients required corticosteroids for an approved indication, or if they had received etomidate in the current hospital admission, or if they had evidence of cerebral malaria or strongyloidiasis, or fungal infections requiring treatment with amphotericin B, or if they had treatment limitations in place or deemed unlikely to survive the next 90 days, or if they had met all inclusion criteria for more than 24 hours prior to randomization, then they were excluded from enrollment. The trial treatment was either an IV infusion of 200 milligrams per day of hydrocortisone or a matched placebo. The trial treatment was reconstituted with normal saline or dextrose to produce a concentration of 1 milligram per mil of hydrocortisone or an equivalent volume of placebo. So effectively, patients received 200 mils per day of the trial treatment. And the duration was for a maximum of 7 days or until ICU discharge or death if earlier. The patients were randomized using a minimization algorithm through a password-protected web-based interface and stratified by participating center and by medical or surgical admission diagnosis. Surgical diagnosis defined as admission to ICU from the operating room or the recovery area. The sites for the trial were chosen based on their prior participation in multicenter trials and after satisfactory completion of a study feasibility questionnaire, which ensured the availability of resources, staff, and the appropriate patient population to conduct the Adrenal trial. And at the time of the selection, all sites indicated the use of evidence-based guidelines for the management of septic shock and the critically ill patient. The trial oversight was by the George Institute, which looked after the operational processes and conducted all statistical analyses and managed the database. There was a pre-specified data monitoring plan. There was a pre-specified source data verification plan. And we had ethics approval for all sites pre-enrollment. And we had prior written informed consent or written consent to continue depending on the jurisdictional requirements. The trial treatment was provided in a blinded, in a vial like this with a completely masked, through a vial which is sealed with a masking tape. And all the patients, the treating clinicians, and the trial personnel were blinded to the trial treatment allocation and the sequence. The integrity of treatment allocation was also independently verified by an independent person in a random sample of treatment packs in 10% of the trial population. We also advised the clinicians about the use of open-label steroids, that the clinician randomizing a patient into the Adrenal trial is prepared to withhold corticosteroids for septic shock, that even if the patient was weaned of inotropes or Pressos, that the trial drug be continued until day 7 or ICU discharge. And if there was a relapse of shock or they required escalating inotrope doses, the corticosteroids are withheld. And if they had a readmission to hospital or ICU with septic shock, that open-label steroids for septic shock be withheld. And that steroids only be used for an approved indication. The outcomes, the primary outcome was day 90 mortality. The secondary outcome was 28-day mortality, resolution of shock and recurrence of shock, length of ICU and hospital stay, duration of mechanical ventilation and recurrence of mechanical ventilation, the incidence of new-onset bacteremia and fungemia, the frequency of blood transfusion, and the duration and frequency of use of renal replacement therapy. The sample size was based on an estimated baseline mortality rate of 33% in septic shock, which was the epidemiological sepsis survey conducted by Simon many years ago. And we aimed for a 5 percentage point absolute risk reduction. And at 90% power, it gave us a sample size of 3,800 patients, 1,900 in each arm. And that allowed us a 1% loss to follow up. We published the study protocol in the year of the commencement of the trial in 2013 and was registered with clinicaltrials.gov. We also published a statistical analysis plan in June of last year, which was finalized and submitted and accepted for publication before the last patient was enrolled and published before the database was locked. There was a data monitoring committee chaired by Duncan Young and comprised of obviously Ian Roberts and John Marshall, when we had 2 interim analyses at the 25% and the 66% mark when these cohort of patients had completed their day 90 follow-up, and the recommendation from the DMC was to continue the trial without modification. The key study dates, we commenced the trial in March 2013. The last enrollment was April 2017, and 3 months later was the last day 90 follow-up. The database was locked in the first week of October. The initial results reviewed around that time, presentation to the management committee and to the Adrenal site investigators in mid-October, and a manuscript was submitted to the journal within 4 weeks of database lock in the first week of November, and obviously presented at Belfast this morning. The results. We screened 21,900 patients. Of those, 5,501 were eligible, and 3,800 patients underwent randomization, which gave us a randomization to eligibility ratio of 69%, suggesting a minimal issues with major enrollment or equipoise issues. Of the 3,800, 1898 were assigned to hydrocortisone, 1902 to placebo, and of these, 114 patients withdrew or did not give consent for primary outcome, and 28 were lost to follow-up, a 0.7% loss to follow-up, which is very low for a trial of this undertaking. And so we had finally 1832 included in the day 90 analysis in the hydrocortisone arm and 1826 in the placebo arm. If you look at enrollment by region, we had 70% enrollment in Australia. We had about 11% in New Zealand, 4% in Denmark and Saudi Arabia, 4% each, and about 10% in the UK. And the treatment allocation was similar across the two groups in each of the 5 countries, as you can see on the screen. If you look at the baseline characteristics, the two groups were very similar at baseline with respect to age, the sex, and the weight, and the admission type, medical versus surgical admission diagnosis. And I'd like to point out that our medical cohort was 68%, which is very similar to the ANAN cohort. If you look at the baseline therapies at randomization, as you would expect, the mechanical ventilation and presso use was approaching 100%, as these were inclusion criteria, and 98% were on antimicrobials, and about 12% were on renal replacement therapy in the 24 hours preceding randomization. The organ functions in the 24 hours preceding randomization, the gray bars indicate the cardiovascular variables. The two groups were very similar with respect to cardiovascular, renal, hepatic, pulmonary, and hematological parameters at baseline. The site of infection, pulmonary sepsis was the predominant source of infection in the medical patients, and GI and abdominal sepsis the predominant source of infection in the surgical patients. The rates of bacteremia were very comparable between the two groups, about 35% in each group. And the breakdown of infection categories were similar between the groups. The time intervals, the time from ICU admission to randomization was again very similar, 26 hours. And time from shock onset to randomization, about 20 hours, very similar between the two groups. And time from randomization to commencement of study drug is about less than 1.5 hours in both groups. So it's a very short commencement of trial run. As I mentioned to you before, the trial drug is infused at 200 mils per day, and so if someone receives a course for 7 days, then the total volume of trial drug would be 1,400 mils. And so we compare the study treatments between the two groups. The cumulative dose of study treatment was similar between the two groups. The cumulative dose duration was similar between the two groups, and there was excellent compliance with the treatment schedule, 95% in both groups, and not statistically different. We also collected data on open label steroid use between the two groups. It was 7.5 versus 8.8%. No difference between the two groups, statistically significant, not significant. And the etomidate use post-randomization was again comparable between the two groups, not significantly different. Primary outcome, day 90 mortality. Hydrocortisone, 27.9% died in the hydrocortisone arm. 28.8% died in the placebo arm with an odds ratio of 0.96. You can see the confidence limits there and a p-value of 0.54. There was no difference in the primary outcome between the two groups. When you look at it with adjustment for stratification variables, again, the odds ratio is very similar with no statistically significant difference between the two groups. When we adjust for additional covariates, such as age and renal replacement therapy and pulmonary sepsis, again, there's no significant difference between the two groups. The time to death, the Kaplan-Meier curves, again, there's no difference between the two groups with a hazard ratio of 0.95 and a p-value of 0.42. We also had 6 predefined subgroups, and we examined the primary outcome in the 6 predefined, the heterogeneity of treatment effect in these 6 groups. Sex, surgical versus medical admissions, sickness severity as defined by an Apache of greater or less than 25, pulmonary or non-pulmonary sepsis, and shock severity as defined by catecholamine dose of greater than 15 mics per minute or less than that, and the duration of shock prior to randomization in 6-hour time bands. So on this graph here, you can see in the extreme left column are the variables. The next column is the proportions in each category. Then you have the hydrocortisone mortality, the placebo mortality, the forest plot, the odds ratio, and the p-value for interaction. And there was no difference in this when it came to looking at in the sex subgroup. Males were 60%. In the proportion of medical patients, 68%. Catecholamine dose, shock severity, again, 54% had greater than 15 mics per minute. There was no difference between the 2 groups. Again, there was no difference between the 2 groups with respect to site of sepsis, the illness severity as defined by an Apache of greater than 25, and time of shock onset to randomization. We also looked at the analysis of primary outcome by region, and you've got the countries listed in the extreme left column with the median Apache score next to it, and the mortality in the hydrocortisone and placebo arms, and the forest plot, and the odds ratios, and the polynomial p-values. And again, there is no difference. There's concordance across all groups. We then asked the question, about 7.5 to 8% received open-label steroids, and could that have been a confounding variable? So we did a post-hoc sensitivity analysis of the primary outcome, excluding patients who received open-label corticosteroids. And again, the odds ratio is 0.96 with wide confidence limits and a p-value of 0.59, which is not statistically significantly different. Now, secondary outcomes. We had a number of secondary outcomes, and just a quick recap. We want to look at the resolution of shock, the recurrence of shock, the duration of ICU and hospital admission, the frequency and duration of mechanical ventilation, frequency and duration of renal replacement therapy, episodes of new bacteremia and fungemia, frequency of blood transfusion, and all-cause mortality 28 days after randomization. Number 1, shock reversal. Patients in the hydrocortisone group had a faster time to shock reversal as compared to the placebo group, a median of 3 versus 4, hazard ratio 1.32, highly significant. And you can see the treatment effect on this graph here. The mean arterial pressure on the y-axis, the study days on the x-axis, the red curve showing the hydrocortisone profiles, and the blue showing the placebo profile. And you can see there's a clear separation during the days of the study treatment period, and the lines converge after day 7. The recurrence of shock was similar between the 2 groups. The time from randomization to cessation of mechanical ventilation, patients in the hydrocortisone arm had a faster time to cessation of the initial episode of mechanical ventilation as compared to placebo, a median of 6 versus 7, with hazard ratio 1.13, which was highly significant. We looked at the length of ventilation and the recurrence of mechanical ventilation. The reventilation rates were similar between the 2 groups. When we look at the days alive and free of ICU, which takes into account the reventilation episodes, the hydrocortisone arm had 2 days more alive and free of mechanical ventilation. But the p-value is just shy of being significant at 0.06. Time from randomization to ICU discharge was again faster in the hydrocortisone group, a median of 10 versus 12, with a hazard ratio of 1.14 and a p-value which is highly significant. When we looked at the ICU-free days, again, patients in the hydrocortisone arm had 2 days more than the placebo group with a p-value of 0.047. But because of the multiplicity of testing, we had to make adjustments, and so we had to apply a correction. And the threshold p-value required for significance was in fact 0.005. So the original p-value of 0.047, which is less than the conventional p-value of 0.05, is in fact not significant. And the days alive and free of hospital were similar between the 2 groups, not statistically significantly different. There were no differences between the 2 groups with respect to days alive and free of renal replacement or the frequency of renal replacement between the two groups. The incidence of new onset bacteremia and fungemia was again similar between the two groups. And fewer patients in the hydrocortisone group required blood transfusion as compared to placebo, 37% versus 42%, which was highly significant. Day 28 mortality was not significantly different between the two groups. Now, adverse events, there were a total of 33 adverse events reported in 27 patients, 24 in the hydrocortisone and 3 in the placebo. And obviously, that difference is significant between the two groups, a higher proportion in the hydrocortisone group. They were predominantly metabolic in nature, high blood sugars and hypernatremia. There were 1 or 2 instances of GI bleed and hematological and encephalopathy issues reported. There were 6 serious adverse events, 4 in the hydrocortisone arm and 2 in the placebo arm. So summary of principal findings. Hydrocortisone did not lead to a significant reduction in mortality at 90 days in patients with septic shock. The effect on mortality did not differ in any of the 6 predefined subgroups. Hydrocortisone led to a more rapid resolution of shock. Hydrocortisone was associated with a shorter duration of the initial episode of mechanical ventilation. Hydrocortisone was associated with an earlier time to ICU discharge. Hydrocortisone was associated with a reduced frequency of blood transfusion. There were no significant differences between the two groups with respect to recurrence of shock, the need for renal replacement therapy, recurrence of mechanical ventilation, the incidence of new onset bacteremia or fungemia. There was a small but a slightly higher incidence of adverse events in the hydrocortisone group, but these did not impact on patient-centered outcomes. The strengths of a study, this was a pragmatic trial with significant statistical power. We had a central randomization with allocation concealment. We blinded our trial group assignments, which were independently verified. We published our statistical analysis plan before unblinding. We specifically targeted a group of patients with higher requirements for vital organ support and a substantial risk of death. And we had a high randomization to eligibility ratio with a low rate of loss to follow-up. And the results were concordant in 5 different healthcare systems in 69 hospitals, which suggests significant external validity to the trial results. The key differences from previous trials, as I mentioned before, the statistical power. We had 3,800 patients as opposed to 299 and 499 in the previous trials. The time to enrollment, I'll talk about that in the next slide. We mandated the mechanical ventilation and inclusion criterion, which was a feature in the ANAN trial but not in the Cordicus trial. We had etomidate naive patients. We administered hydrocortisone by infusion as compared to bolus administrations in previous trials. We did not use a tapering strategy. We did not use corticotropin testing as its interpretation is controversial in critically ill patients. And we did not use fludrocortisone. Talking about timelines, and these were the timelines which have been reported in previous trials. And we enrolled 3,800 patients in 4 years and 1 month, which mitigates secular trends in mortality. Now, the next important question is, what did we learn from the DMC? Now, the DMC did 2 pre-specified analyses, and the first one was the 950 patients. This is very close to the first interim analysis. This is not precisely the first interim analysis. At the sample size of 950, which is twice the size of Cordicus and 3 times the size of Anand's original trial, the point estimate was in fact in favor of hydrocortisone. The DMC used the Habertle-Peto stopping rule and advised us to continue the trial. As the study progressed, at the 1840 mark, which is 3.5 times the size of Cordicus and 6 times the size of Anand's original trial, the point estimate comes towards the midline, and the difference between the two groups is not significant anymore. At the second interim analysis at the 2,900 patient mark, which is approximately 6 times the size of Cordicus and 10 times the announced original trial, again, the point estimate is close to the midline with no differences between the two groups. And at study completion, you can see the forest plots there. And in fact, between the second, the third, and the fourth plots reported there, there's very little difference in the odds ratio and the confidence intervals. And it emphasizes the importance of stopping rules, of very clear-cut stopping rules and appropriate stopping rules, and the importance of large sample sizes. The next thing to consider is the sepsis criteria. We used sepsis 2 criteria, and the sepsis 3 criteria were promulgated after our trial was designed and commenced. And so the question really is, what would have happened had we applied the sepsis 3 criteria to our trial? Now, this is a post hoc analysis, and the sepsis 3 criteria briefly is a MAP less than 65 and a lactate greater than 2 in the setting of adequate fluid balance. And we didn't have data on fluid balance, but we have data on the proportion of patients who had a MAP less than 65 and a lactate greater than 2 in the 24 hours preceding randomization. And we had 1,800 patients, and almost equal distribution between the two groups. Now, the mortality rates are about 4 percentage points higher as compared to our original sepsis 2, the original mortality rates. But again, the difference between the two groups, there was no treatment effect seen treatment differences seen between the two groups, even using sepsis 3 criteria. And this is an updated systematic review and meta-analysis, which has been driven by Sophie Reigard from Anne Sperner's group and Anthony Delaney from Sydney. And you can see the adrenal data included in the bottom row, and the point estimate is right bang in the middle there, and concordant with the original trial results. So in conclusion, the administration of hydrocortisone did not result in lower 90-day mortality than placebo among mechanically ventilated patients with septic shock. Some secondary outcomes were better in the hydrocortisone group. This has been published online in the New England Journal this morning, and we would like to acknowledge the patients, the families, and the staff who kindly donated their time and allowed us to study them. I would like to thank all the site investigators and the research coordinators, to our wonderful project manager, Dorlin, and the George team, the ANZIC's CTG community, to our international collaborators from Denmark and UK and Saudi, without whom this trial wouldn't have been possible, to the members of the management committee, and to the staff of the New England Journal of Medicine who gave us a fast-track response to meet the meeting schedule. These were the sites which took part in the trial, and this is the management committee with whom I've had the privilege of working and learning from over the last 5 years. Thank you all.
That's an amazingly big trial. Thank you so much. Kathy, we'll have questions after we've had your editorial. Is that okay with you?
Of course.
So, Kathy Rowan from ICNARC is going to give us an editorial view on the study. Yes?
Just getting your slides up, Kathy, just 1 second.
Oh, you put them on the same machine?
Is that yours?
Anna, thank you for the kind introduction. Rob, thank you so much for giving me the honour of presenting this Adrenal trial editorial. It really, truly is an honour. And Bala, having not been involved in the trial at all, thank you so much for confidentially providing me the information so that I was able to do an independent sort of review or editorial of the Adrenal trial. So I'm just going to give you my reflections as a clinical trialist who's gone through all those very documents that Bala has referred to. So my first reflection is, wow, what a trial. Congratulations. And those congratulations are really to some really key people. If you've done this, you realize how much hard work it is. This was about 10 years of Bala's life for a 30-minute presentation. The return on investment is, sometimes you only get 10 minutes. So again, thank you, Rob, for allowing us this long session to discuss this in detail. So thanks to Bala. Thanks to Doralyn. I know your role. I know your role in coordinating the trial. Bala knows your role. Fabulous, absolutely wonderful. To my friends in the Division of Critical Care and Trauma at the George Institute for Global Health in Sydney. This is a huge team of people in the background that actually deliver these things, and everybody plays their role, even the legal side and the ethical side and the governance side. To the management committee, who oversee it, and as Bala referred to, have led him through this. To the research coordinators and the trial investigators at the sites, because actually you can do as much as you want centrally, unless it's delivered locally, it really doesn't happen. To the data monitoring committee, 2 Brits got in there, so we can claim a little bit of association. To the funders, Bala's recognised these, and certainly in the UK sites, it was good to see that the NIHR Clinical Research Network provided the support so the 12 UK sites could deliver to the trial. And to the ANZIC CTG, don't we hate them? They're just so good at pulling off these big trials. But fabulous, another wonderful trial from the ANZIC Clinical Trials Group. So as Bala's referred to, sort of pre-adrenal, and you have to go back, to sort of that decade between 2000 and 2010, the multi-center randomized controls trials evaluating lower dose hydrocortisone were the Anand trial and Charlie Sprung's Corticus trial. And then come along the Aussies, the Venkatesh et al. Adrenal trial, and they sort of blow the other players out of the water. And when have you ever seen the Aussies do that, blow the other players out of the park? But I think it's really, really important that we reflect on just how well this was designed with the statistical power to detect a clinically plausible effect on a relevant patient-centered primary outcome. 90% power is always good to aim for, and a 5% absolute risk reduction is really a key with that sort of baseline mortality estimate of 33%. Note the actual baseline in the placebo arm was 29%, so we're still seeing those improvements in septic shock outcomes over time. And it was, this is me independently speaking now, a high-quality conducted and reported RCT. It was pragmatic and multi-center, we've heard. The blinding, the matched placebo, it really was well-blinded and well-matched. The trained research coordinators, the data monitoring and source data verification, the pre-publication, and then the strong adherence to the protocol and SAP. I've had one on this side and the publication on that side, and I've done a cross-check, and everything is there that they said they would do. And when it's new, it's actually indicated that it's a new post hoc addition. Strong governance and ethics, study management committee, and an independent data monitoring committee. So as far as I'm concerned, Bala and team, you have my respect. So I thought, as a trialist, what I would do is just reflect on the adrenal trial using those building blocks that we're all familiar with, the sort of the PICO, the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcomes. So if we think about, first of all, the included population, adults 18 years plus, mechanically ventilated at randomization, including non-invasive and bi-level CPAP, a documented strong suspicion of infection, 2 or more SIRS, and treated with vasopressors or inotropes for more than 4 hours and still being so at randomization. So very much a sort of a septic shock population in the old sepsis 2 definition. And as Bala's now shown us the sepsis 3 analysis, I've not seen that before, but you can see that it was about 52.5% of the sepsis 2 septic shock population that actually met the sepsis 3 septic shock definition. And again, we're thinking about how we might generalize the findings to our own situation. And here I'd like to acknowledge Manu Shankahari and David Harrison and Gordon Rubenfeld, because we too have done a little bit of work looking at the epidemiology of a sepsis 2 defined population and a sepsis 3 defined population. And interestingly, we find that when you look at the sepsis 2 defined septic shock, this is in England in about 650,000 ICU admissions, we found that actually a much smaller proportion of those who were defined as sepsis 2 definition septic shock actually were also sepsis 3 septic shock. And I think the key thing to look at there is the difference in that hospital mortality, that the sepsis 3 septic shock definitions actually do identify a much sicker group with a much higher mortality, just as we reflect on how we interpret the trial. So what about the population excluded? And Bala showed the top half of the consort diagram to us, and as you can see, there was the 21,000 screened and the 3,800 who underwent randomization. If we just pick into that consort diagram a bit, there's our 21,818 screened. Eligible but excluded was, with good reasons, and all listed, is about 7.8%, the 1,701. Enrolled is the next biggest proportion, the 3,800. Not meeting the inclusion criteria, I think a reasonable, justified reason not to be included in the trial. It's really those that met the exclusion criteria that maybe we need to give some thought to. This is the biggest proportion in that consort diagram, and the reasons are not listed, so we don't get a feel for which ones met which exclusion criteria. And I find myself wanting to know how many met all the inclusion criteria for more than 24 hours when they were identified. Sort of why were those patients who less than 24 hours ago, if they'd been caught in time, would have been in the trial, one would anticipate. So just something around what were those numbers and what did that do to the population that were included in the adrenal trial. And while I'm comfortable with that notion of not wanting to include patients who are very likely to die, all the work I've ever looked at where clinicians, and I would certainly be no better myself, try and predict patients who are going to die within 90 days of randomization, we're not very good at it. And again, would be interested in knowing the numbers, what that does to the excluded. Given the excluded was the biggest proportion in the consort diagram when you go from screened through to randomized. Also, here we are sort of in Belfast. In the UK, we want to kind of get some sense about that population in the adrenal trial and sort of how generalizable they are to us over here. And yes, there were sites UK sites in the trial, but obviously 82% of the population were recruited, from Australia and New Zealand. And I just thought it would be quite interesting, and here I must thank my head statistical colleague, David Harrison, who, not knowing the results of the trial, I asked him to do a sort of an analysis for me. These come from our case mix program database. But I think what's quite interesting, so we tried to emulate the adrenal inclusion criteria, so they're sepsis-3 septic shock, adult 18 plus years, ventilated, and they spent 4 or more hours in the ICU. We've kind of assumed that the septic shock cases would meet after that 4-hour criteria about vasopressors, etc. So very similar age, slightly older in the English cohort, slightly less males, slightly less weighty, but very similar proportions you can see there of the medical and surgical admissions, and a severity score, a median severity score of 22 compared with 23 in the trial. And again, because we've selected out the mechanically ventilated and those on inotropes and vasopressors, obviously there's always in a trial a few that slip through that don't quite meet the bill. So very, very similar when you take a cohort out of our English data. When you look at the physiology data, again, just thinking of this generalizability to our data, very similar physiology, perhaps other than the highest lactate. And we have slightly more patients, as we select them out, that have a pulmonary or as their primary site of infection. What that does, I have no idea in terms of whether differential effects of hydrocortisone might occur by different sites of infection. There is some stuff in the literature about it may act differently or differentially in different groups, like community-acquired pneumonia. Looking at the intervention, I won't take too long on this because Bala has done this, but there still seems to me a debate in the literature about boluses versus continuous infusions. So we need to remember as we discuss the trial that it was this continuous intravenous infusion over 24 hours. There's debate over how long you deliver the hydrocortisone, if you deliver it. In the trial, it was this 7 days or until death and discharge from ICU. The no tapering strategy, it's true, there was a trial that showed that using a tapering strategy made no difference, but again, probably worth remembering that as we come to discuss the trial clinically. No administration of a mineralocorticoid, like fludrocortisone, so again, that differs from the other trials. None of this notion of being a responder or a non-responder that was in the Corticus trial, so no corticofin testing, and patients treated with etomidate were excluded. But all of this within the context of, I said, sophisticated blinding and very obvious that the patients, treating clinicians, trial personnel were blinded to treatment allocation, making it extremely good and well-conducted trial. The comparator we've heard about, it was really usual care. It's a pragmatic trial, but the sites were selected such that they were using the evidence-based guidelines for septic shock care. So probably and hopefully best known care throughout the trial in the comparator arm. Moving to the outcome, I think we all know this one, that there was no difference in the 90-day mortality. There were 16 secondary outcomes. 14 have been reported to date in the work that Bala has presented. They're there, and Bala has told us the ones that were significant after testing for multiplicity, time to resolution of shock, time to discharge from ICU, time to cessation of mechanical ventilation, and this sort of new finding that's probably a hypothesis-generating type finding, this notion that more patients in the hydrocortisone arm, less patients, forgive me, receive blood transfusion. And then just looking at this table, it's quite interesting that whereas the time to reversal of shock is significant and there's similar rates of recurrence of shock in the two arms, that though time to discharge is significantly different, it's sooner, actually when you look at the days alive and free, there's no difference. So it's sort of this notion that you're achieving something, but then it's not a sustained effect. The same with ventilation. Time to cessation of initial ventilation, significant, but actually days alive and free of mechanical ventilation, a difference, and we talked about a direction towards significance, but it's not significant. and then this finding of blood transfusion. I think what this really, really points out to me is how important the bit we haven't seen yet is going to be, and that's the mortality and quality of life at 6 months. Not so much that I'm expecting some great change in the mortality, but I think it really, these results that we've seen today and heard today really point towards the need for an economic evaluation alongside this trial. It may well be that although there's no downstream difference in mortality, that actually it could still perhaps show cost effectiveness, or the economic evaluation might show us that hydrocortisone has a role because of it sort of could be cost saving. We just went to the British National Formulary and just having a look, and a full 7-day course in the NHS, the indicative price is £9.17 for 100 milligrams, and therefore you're talking about 130 quid for a course, so not a huge cost to throw into all the other, obviously, factors that would need to be played into that economic evaluation. Outcomes and adverse events. I don't think we should forget the adverse events. I think there's a little bit of a challenge around how these were done in the trial. They were deemed by the treating clinicians to be possibly, probably, or definitely study drug related and listed in the product information sheet. So there sort of was the pre-specified ones, perhaps not the flexibility for non-specified other ones, and there was no adjudication. So I think perhaps that's a challenge to the reporting of the safety outcomes. I think it is important that there were no SUSARs, so there were no suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions. And I think it's just, Bala presented these sort of as a sort of overview, looking at the different ones and seeing the ones that, the asterisk ones here, that are the serious adverse events. I think it's always important when we read trials, we tend to look at the primary and secondary outcomes and forget to go to the adverse events to look at those safety outcomes too. So what about the outcomes and the generalizability to our trial? And again, this is looking at the placebo arm of the Adrenal trial there and looking at our English data. And I think this is why I'm so interested in who got excluded in terms of the timing and in terms of this notion of predicting 90-day mortality and assuming and excluding ones who look likely to die. Quite frightening numbers for the English data, admittedly not exactly matched or matched as best as we can to the cohort in the Adrenal trial, but it would seem that the 90-day mortality for the English cohort is about 58.7% as compared with the placebo cohort in the Adrenal trial of about 29%. So I want to understand those differences a little bit more, and I think it may have something to do with later presentation to critical care. So maybe some of those patients who are being excluded sort of are the very patients who are appearing late to ICU in England, in the UK, but also perhaps some exclusion of those who would have definitely died. And then looking at things like the 28-day mortality, again, much higher. Times to discharge from ICU, a little longer. Days alive and free, lower. Time to discharge from hospital, again, lower. Days alive and free, lower. Days alive and free of mechanical ventilation and renal replacement therapy, lower. And slightly higher use of, just to try and get a feel for how we might put the Adrenal trial results in the context of how we deliver care, what outcomes we achieve for similar types of patients in England. So in conclusion, with all of that, look at the trial, perhaps a little bit of critique on some of the methods, I still think it's a wow, an absolute wow. And I congratulate you, Bala, for the most amazing achievement. And so finally, I'm quite interested now. This is straight from the bottom line, one of my favorite sources of going to find out what's going on in the world. And I think now with the Surviving Sepsis Campaign International Guidelines for Management of Sepsis and Septic Shock, 2016. I'm not sure that we're still in the situation of a weak recommendation and low quality of evidence. I think we have high quality of evidence, but it'll be quite interesting to hear the discussion about where this might move forward and perhaps what more we might need to move this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Now, it's your turn. Questions. Hopefully, we've got lots on Twitter, and we have some roving microphones for people with a burning question to ask. Could I please ask that you don't deliver a monologue and your own critique of the paper and actually ask a question? So I think your hand was up first while our Twitter moderator gets his thoughts together.
Great trial. It is an absolutely wow trial. I'm personally interested in the vasopressor aspect of things. So based on what we're doing currently, before we knew adrenal outcomes, most of us would go to steroids when we're going rapidly escalating either one vasopressor or going on to our second vasopressor. You had a cohort of more than 15 mics per minute of norepinephrine versus less than 15 mics per minute of norepinephrine. Would your results have been different had you chosen a cohort with a higher vasopressor requirement? What prompted you to choose 15 mics per minute? Would this not have been more applicable to 20 mics per minute and some vasopressin added on?
Thank you. So we did not mandate a minimum dose of vasopressors for enrollment into the trial. The 15 mics per minute was really a cutoff which was used following the reporting in the VAST study, where they used that as an evidence of shock severity and showed some differential outcomes. The ANAN trial, they're now doing the APROX trial, as you know. They're using 25 mics per minute as a threshold. And we have done some post-hoc sensitivity analysis, and using that criteria, again, I didn't have the time to show it. We did not actually see any differences in outcomes between the two groups. So 15 mics per minute it's about 0.25 mics per 0.2 and 0.25 mics per kilo for a 60 kilo person, about 0.2 mics per kilo, which is a reasonable dose.
Thank you.
Yes? Have we got a microphone over there? You were waving from the beginning.
So given that blood pressure got better with hydrocortisone and steroids retain salt and water, you might think that the hydrocortisone group may have got less fluid over the first few days. So first, could I just check that this was the post-starch era this trial was done in? And secondly, is there any way or interest in looking at those centres retrospectively who have electronic record keeping systems about fluid balance at day 3, day 7, whether that was different?
Look, a good question. It's possible that might have been the case. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we're looking at the reduced transfusion requirements in the hydrocortisone group. It's a new finding, and we do not know the basis for that. It's possible that it's because the hydrocortisone group spent less time in intensive care, and therefore they didn't get as much blood, or they didn't get so much fluid, and therefore they weren't hemodiluted. But we actually don't have data on fluids. We might consider doing that as a follow-up sub-study.
Okay, our Twitter moderator has some questions.
Twitter has been very positive and very complimentary about the study. I think it was an excellent study, but there's a couple of themes that keep coming up. One of the first ones is, do you think the site of infection matters, given the recent evidence that steroids in patients with pneumonia appears to be beneficial? Do you think we're missing patients? We should just be treating the pneumonias with steroids rather than all comers with sepsis?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we actually had pulmonary sepsis as one of the predefined subgroups in the primary outcome analysis. and we did not see a differential treatment effect. So, and as you know, there have been a number of other studies which have looked at this, the development of nosocomial pneumonia in patients with traumatic brain injury and trauma, and steroids don't seem to have made a major difference in outcomes in those groups. One of the original studies was the convalescence study, which showed that hydrocortisone improves outcomes in patients with pneumonia, but it really hasn't been followed up with any large-scale studies after that.
Ask another one.
Hey, any more burning questions on Twitter?
Some of the other questions are about the infusion versus boluses. So there's been some evidence recently that physiologically we secrete cortisol in a bolus fashion, so maybe giving steroids in a bolus rather than infusion might be beneficial. Do you think maybe if we did it with bolus doses rather than infusions, we might see a difference?
Yeah. A good question. So I guess I'll have to give you a bit of information background to this. So when we were designing the trial and after we got the funding sorted and looked at how we were going to give the corticosteroids, and one of the challenges we had was obviously acquiring the placebo. And so we were looking at the best ways of administering hydrocortisone, which would minimize all the issues with the placebo. And we looked at the bolus and the infusion. So around that time, the convalescence study had come out saying hydrocortisone by infusion was good. We then went back and looked at the literature. There were two studies, the Briegel study published in 1999 and the study by Didier K et al., where they looked at the inflammatory markers and shock reversal when given as an infusion, and they found that there was a significant pharmacodynamic effect of steroids when given as an infusion. And then we looked at the physical stability of hydrocortisone when it's made up in an infusion bag and it's stable for 24 hours according to the product information sheet. We then looked at the compatibility with other IV drugs, and hydrocortisone was not neutralized in any way. And so based on physical stability, based on chemical compatibility, based on pharmacodynamic equivalence, and there have been other studies. The Arabi study also showed, especially in people with shock and given by infusion, there was evidence of shock reversal. So using all that as the background, we opted to go for the infusion approach, which reduced the problems for us in terms of acquiring placebo.
There's a lot of I's being dotted and T's being crossed here. There's an amazing amount of work gone on in this study. Yes, have we got a microphone? You've got one.
Congratulations on a very nice trial and presentation. Do you consider the statistically significant secondary outcomes patient important?
Yes. So the question really is this, I guess, is this going to change practice? I think, okay, so let's start. Primary outcome, there's no difference, although there's a 0.9 percentage point reduction in the hydrocortisone arm. So the number needed to treat would be about 111 patients to prevent one death. So if you look at this, certainly evidence of hemodynamic stability, which probably is the reason why clinicians feel comfortable in terms of weaning patients from mechanical ventilation. So I think that translates into earlier wean from mechanical ventilation. Possibly an earlier discharge from intensive care, although that didn't show up on the multiplicity testing. And certainly a reduced incidence of blood transfusion. And importantly, no evidence of harm. So I think that on balance, probably the pendulum is now swinging more towards using hydrocortisone. Although if people choose to maintain a contrary view, I think that's perfectly acceptable. But I think when putting all this together, and if you're able to reduce one-day stay in intensive care and so on, I think there will be significant cost implications for triage in the future. So I think they are probably clinically relevant. And as Kathy mentioned before, we are following up with a health economic analysis. Kelly Thompson, one of our people from the management committee, is driving this.
Right, so I think we'll, sorry, Danny, can it wait till coffee time? We need to move on with our panel discussion. Do you want to take us seat again.
Okay.
So, panel, are there enough nails in this particular coffin? Have I been ranting on my unit about steroids being no good for septic shock correctly? Simon, is it going to change your practice?
Oh, look, obviously, I've had the privilege of being involved in the design and the running of this trial, so I've known about the results for a little while. And I think, I'd first of all like to say, I think this is really important what Rob is doing here. You know, there are people who tweet and email and say it's a nonsense, why don't you release the results straight away? The fact is they need reflection, they need discussion, and we know that practice change takes about 7 years usually when evidence is introduced. So whether we hold it back by a little bit as we have done, and it's been published, it's free online, full text at NEJM right now, so get it now. You can download the paper and think about it. So we've had the results for a while. We've done some post hoc analyses. We've thought about it. I was with you. I don't give people steroids for septic shock. Haven't done. Thought they didn't work. But there's some really interesting stuff in the data. The question of bolus versus infusion, you can see physiological effects there. You can see differences in blood pressure and vasopressor use. So the process measures suggest that giving it by infusion was doing the same thing as happened in the other trials when it was given by bolus. So to me, that's irrelevant. But the other thing is, if you looked at the graph and took in the graph of blood pressure effect, you would see that there's although the y-axis is truncated and makes it look much more, it's a bit like how they present stock market prices. Mm-hmm. It makes it look very impressive. But nevertheless, there was an effect there that tapered off when we stopped the steroids at 7 days. And I think when we looked at the data, there's about 40% of the patients were still on vasopressors at day 7. So we're stopping the steroids at day 7, which is what the other trials did and showed, Jalali showed treatment effects, stopping the steroids at day 7. So regrettably, as Richard Smith of the BMJ told me when we did the SAFE study, no trial ever answers every question, no matter how big it is, how well it's conducted, and so on. So I'm finding I was very much in your camp. I haven't given steroids to anyone. I'm beginning to think maybe I might have been a little bit wrong, which is good, because I think it's really good that we prove ourselves wrong and we embrace uncertainty, because we can't improve our patients' outcomes unless we accept that some of what we're doing now is wrong. So I haven't started giving people steroids for septic shock yet, because that would have upset my colleagues. And I think, unfortunately, Bala, there does need to be Adrenal too. Because there are still unanswered questions. So up till now, I've thought that people who gave steroids for septic shock were deluding themselves. Now I'm going to find it harder to criticize them. The secondary outcomes, I've been watching Twitter and watching England win the second one-day international, but there are people commenting on what is the importance of these things. One of the things that patients in the ICU hate is being on a mechanical ventilator. If you ask patients afterwards what they hated that tube. So things that shortened duration of mechanical ventilation are actually important. Shortening duration of shock, not quite so important. Patients really don't care whether you're running noradrenaline through their central line or not, but shortening that. And I think we will do an economic analysis. That's obviously planned, that we will do a health economic analysis of the trial and we'll publish that. And I suspect it will favor corticosteroids, because the main driver of costs is duration of time in the ICU.
Yeah.
So my bottom line is, and I think the other thing is that we kid ourselves that we can look at a patient and know whether an individual treatment is going to benefit that individual patient, and mostly we can't. So I'm seriously thinking I might have to change my practice.
Karen, were we doing the right thing? Giving an infusion? Should we be giving boluses? You're an endocrinologist. What's your take on the trial?
Well, first of all, congratulations and wow, yeah, so it's really amazing what has been done, an effort of the world. Regarding the comment on bolus infusion, I don't know, because it's all completely, utterly unphysiological, what is happening in the ICU, so it's not that we have adapted to this, what is happening, so the classical critical care has existed for 60, 70, 80 years, so it's something that nature hasn't planned. And there is never a time of zero cortisol secretion in the body. But something else I would like to bring up and discuss with you and the world is hormones, particularly steroid hormones like cortisol, hydrocortisone, as the physiological metabolite, but also vitamin D, take a time to act. So, and what is happening in the ICU is happening very fast. So have you looked at, or if not, I would prompt you to do something very unconventional. Exclude early deaths. Because exclude early deaths. Because it takes, so there are immediate effects, and there are mediated effects that take days. So it would be a point of discussion, what is early death? But is it 3 days, 4 days, 5 days? But if you exclude the very early deaths where hydrocortisone had no way of changing something, would that maybe change the primary outcome? I don't know. And also with this, so as you mentioned, I mean, cardiologists are very happy about a 0.9% mortality difference. So it's not nothing, if it's true and if it stays, yeah? And also, another thing I would like to bring up is always in trials, particularly in mortality trials, of course, there are people that get out anyway, that are not sick enough. And then there are people that are so sick they cannot be helped, no matter what you do. So what you want to do is target the patients who have a chance of modification of the outcome. And it's hard to identify them. And as Kathy pointed out, we are very bad at predicting outcomes in patients. So there was a slight hint from lower catecholamine doses and lower Apache scores having more benefits. So maybe the people who are stuck in their sepsis avalanche have no chance. And by excluding them somehow post-hoc, I don't know how, but I would really be interested about the early deaths.
Do you want to respond to that?
Okay, we'll start with the other thing to note about the infusion question is also that there's the people who receive corticosteroids by infusion have a lower incidence of adverse metabolic effects. That's the Louisa's work. And in fact, the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines recommend giving it by infusion. And also, I think even Addisonian crises now, they actually recommend giving steroids by infusion rather than as a bolus. But that's an aside. In terms of, targeting, it's very hard to identify patients who would or who wouldn't benefit. And, but when we looked at the illness severity of Apache less than or greater than 25, I don't think you can, I know there's that signal of the point estimate being in favor of hydrocortisone, but overall there was really no statistically significant difference. And I think that's really all we can go by, and we can go back and look at a subgroup post-hoc analyses and I guess look at early deaths versus late deaths and see if there are, and there's going to be a 6-month mortality, there's going to be quality of life data which will come out, though the other 2 secondary outcomes which we didn't report here. So I think, look, yes, there is more work to be done, apart from adrenal too.
Yeah. Another small comment I still want to make, so it's evident for you as trialists, but maybe not for everybody, that certainly a 200 milligrams hydrocortisone dose is also super physiological. So that's 10 times or 15 times the amount that you and I secrete currently when we're not on stage here, but usually at home. So it's a high dose still.
Anders, is it going to change practice in Denmark?
I don't know about Denmark, but I'll do something I do very rarely, and that's oppose Professor Finker's opinion. Normally I fully agree, but this I think I have a different stand. Obviously, the primary result of this trial is no effect on 90-day mortality. And for me, the most important secondary outcome measures are those that are more patient-centered. And in my opinion, those are days alive and out of hospital, days alive without mechanical ventilation, and they did not differ between groups. To echo what Kathy said, we will, in my opinion, have to await the long-term outcomes, particularly quality of life. This will be very important. And we will, I think, have to await data synthesis with other low risk of bias trials, so updated systematic reviews of other trials with a low risk of bias. And once we have all those data, I think I'm ready to make a decision. For now, I will wait and use no steroids.
We've all got our fingers crossed for the moment, yes. So, Tony, why are the outcomes so much worse in the UK on Kathy's data than the placebo group?
Yes, Tony.
What are we doing wrong?
So, well, the first obvious thing is Kathy's is not trial data. And as you said, that's all comers. That's the case mix program. Yeah. And Bala's given the exclusion criteria. So trials are a select group, and that will account for some of that. We treat people every day that we think might not survive 90 days, but we don't know for sure. And and they would have been excluded by these criteria. So there was also patients refused to consent and some physicians. So there are reasons that they won't look exactly the same. Are UK outcomes worse? I mean, I tried to look at it very quickly. They were slightly...
It's 32% mortality in the UK.
So it is slightly higher. Not way... I thought it might be worse. So I was actually quite relieved that they are within that same bounds, but there are many reasons about how healthcare is delivered. Some may also be population decisions, and having worked in Australia quite a long time ago, and maybe things have changed in the UK as well. There's the sort of types of patients who come to ICU who may be very different. What populations choose when it may be end-of-life decisions, I think are probably different culturally, not just in how the hospital works, within the population. So that may account for some of it. Well, to potentially slightly disagree with Anders, though, about some of the comments. I absolutely agree around it's the patient-centered outcomes that are important, and as Simon said, mechanical ventilation is important. Blood transfusion, if I was a patient, I would rather not have a blood transfusion, so I think that is important, as you said. Hypothesis generating. One question maybe Bala can tell us, why did you collect it? Why did you have it as a secondary outcome? What was the rationale for that? It wouldn't have been on my top list of secondary outcomes.
So we collected blood transfusion as a marker of bleeding in intensive care. Okay. So, and obviously it doesn't have to be a marker of bleeding. Yeah. And that was highlighted in the review process. So we stuck to just the blood transfusion rates.
But I suppose my question is, and I don't want to get into a statistical debate because I'm sure we're not interested, but the days alive and free, although they make sense, and having used them in a trial myself, they are very problematic, and depending on how you calculate them, you can get very different answers. And I think, is this why we see something happen more quickly or a shorter duration or something, but it didn't translate? Because there are statistical issues about how you deal with deaths, whether you count for 28 days or 90 days. These are all going to weight it. So that's one thing around the statistic, but the other thing around trial designs and so on is, again, it looks like the patients got better. The shock got better quicker, the ventilation finished quicker, less blood transfusion. They look like they were better, yet it doesn't translate into a mortality benefit. And I wonder where that leaves us designing trials. I've thought a lot about outcomes, and all of us as trialists would have thought about it. But when I write a prescription in the ICU, I don't always think this is going to change whether this patient lives or dies. but it's doing a lot of useful things. So obviously you can see I do use steroids in some patients, in the sicker ones, and I will probably carry on doing. But I do think about how we go forward with testing new interventions, because it looks like a drug is doing something, but it doesn't translate into a mortality benefit. So how do we bring new drugs on is the question.
Yeah. Kathy, you've been itching to say something. So.
Well, there's a couple of things just picking up on what I've heard. One is, I do worry about us doing ICU trials, in ICU trials, and assuming that everybody gets to the ICU at the same time, if that makes sense. And so we do have this problem that we don't know the illness trajectory, the sepsis illness trajectory of patients. So I do worry that if we do all our trials in ICU, and I know exactly why we do, that brings a problem of interpretability or generalizability. The other thing on the looking better, the children in the FEAST trial looked better, and the trial was stopped.
So absolutely,
I do worry about a sort of, we just need to, think about these things. And then also on the sort of patient-centeredness, I strongly urge us to focus on patient-centeredness. But I think mechanical ventilation is uncomfortable. I also think if we can deliver outcomes, to essentially get more care for our healthcare pound or our healthcare dollar, the economic benefit to the system, being able to treat more patients, is something that should really, really be considered. So often, as long as there isn't a signal of harm, something that may not be clinically effective on a patient-centered outcome may actually also still help the system in terms of being, a cost-effective intervention to deliver to patients, particularly if it has some comfortability, not having a blood transfusion, getting off a mechanical ventilator sooner.
Just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting we move to surrogate endpoints, because I absolutely get that people looking better is not a good outcome. But this is what I mean. I think our treatments do things that may be beneficial for the patient, but it may just not translate into a statistically significant difference in mortality. There could be a significance if you'd done 8,000 patients, I know that's an assumption.
That's an Adrenal 3.
But that's exactly, we're not about to do that, are we?
One thing I thought was really interesting was the governance of this study appears to have been impeccable. If this was a new drug and your first and second interim analyses were showing that it was beneficial, how much pressure do you think you might have had from a pharmaceutical company to stop at that point? I'm thinking back to activated protein C here. That trial was stopped early, wasn't it?
I think it just comes back to having a very well set up DMC and robust stopping rules, and having the rules. We had a DMC charter in place before we started, and we agreed upon the stopping rules and the differences in mortality that we will have to stop early, and that the threshold for stopping the trial for harm is much earlier than for stopping for differences. In
having an experienced DMC is really important, because it's not only your rules. I mean, as Richard Pito said years and years and years ago, if you're just going to use the rules, you don't need a committee, you just need a pocket calculator. So you actually need an experienced DMC that looks at the totality of the evidence and just doesn't take this early. And when you see a massive treatment effect early in a trial, it's most likely chance. And there's a wonderful paper about a leukemia trial that I use in all my talks on that issue. So you need an experienced committee to do that. I'd like to do a show of hands thing, because I'd be really interested in the people here. If you can put your hand up if you routinely give steroids to people with septic shock. It's not going to be the question you expect. Go on, be brave. Nobody's looking at you. Keep your hand up if you stop them at 7 days, even if the patient's still on vasopressors. That's interesting, isn't it? Because in fact we haven't. That's why we need Adrenal too. Carla. because although we've designed a study and got it funded and conducted an excellent study looking at what the research data from those trials, limited, suggested was beneficial, it's not actually what people are doing.
Yes, Anders.
So when you plan Adrenal 2, I think it will be very important to capture
He hasn't got any
outcomes,
hair now.
more outcomes that will answer the questions that we discuss now, because this is rehabilitation, resources used for that.
Different duration.
Resources used in the ward after ICU discharge, return to employment and stuff like that, because we now envision that this may be cost beneficial, but we can only measure on the stuff we have in the database.
Yep.
And back in employment, resource use in rehabilitation will not be...
They're planning, aren't you, Bala, data linkage to hospital data to be able to achieve some of those costs. So I think the economic evaluation will.
But I mean, Adrenal 1 isn't over yet. You know, I mean, we now know we have increasing data on the long-term adverse effects of sepsis, let alone septic shock. And so the longer-term outcomes may well influence my decision. That's why I'm still on the fence a bit, because we haven't got the economic analysis, we haven't got the longer-term effects, and those are very, very important. We know that the so-called post-sepsis syndrome is a real thing and affects a lot of people. There's a lovely paper by Hallie Prescott in JAMA with Derek Angus a couple of weeks ago about this. So the longer-term effects, and you can't argue that they're not patient-centered, they are really important. And when we look at the 6-month stuff and we do the data linkage to look at health, resource use, etc., I may fall on one or other side of the fence depending on what they show.
Yeah, Bala.
Just to go back to Tony's question, so why didn't it actually make a difference to mortality? I think it's worth discussing that, because I think because we don't understand sepsis and why people actually die in sepsis, because the number of trials have shown improved perfusion and organ function with adjunct treatments and so on, but it hasn't translated. And there are obviously things like your cellular failure, your mitochondrial failure, and those are things for which we really have no mechanisms to modulate, though at the cellular level still. And I suspect they're probably very critical in determining outcomes.
Yeah, and I think there may be a dark hole about the adverse events, and this is not only for this trial, this is us in general. We are very, very reluctant to see that drugs that we give harm patients, so we do not report adverse events in clinical practice, and I guess the adverse events reporting in Adrenal was in the lower end, and potentially there is a big difference between groups. I mean, the risk increase, relative risk increase in adverse events is very high. No, very few data, probably under-reporting.
Before we move on to the last bit, has this changed what you're going to do? So the people in the audience who didn't put their hands up for giving steroids in septic shock, put your hands up if you are now converted. There was a sort of significant proportion. So there's a few hands going up. I have to confess, I'm still so cynical. I'm desperate to know what those long-term outcomes are.
What about the other way? What about the people who gave steroids and are now going to stop?
I mean, if they're better, then I'm done for, aren't I? I'm going to have to retire from intensive care medicine because I can't bring myself to do this. Don't die without getting the dose of the steroids. Right, it's an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I'm sure we could carry on for hours, but we're already running a little bit behindhand, and we need to give Bala time to tell us about the trials and tribulations of actually running such a study.
Okay, so, look, there are obviously many experienced trialists and researchers here who have done large-scale trials and published, and I'm sure we've all had challenges unique to those trials, and I just want to report the Adrenal experience to you, some of the unique problems that we faced, and hopefully would provide us with a platform for learning from, and perhaps form a discussion group so people can actually engage with other people and say, look, how did you deal with this problem and how did you fix it, and so on. So the story behind Adrenal is really about developing the proposal, the attempts to secure funding, the obstacles that we faced, and it's about the importance of collaboration and importance of persistence. And the obstacles were, 1 was acquiring placebo, 2, ethics, 3, getting it internationalized, 4, there are traps everywhere, 5, importantly, the inconsistencies in the interpretation of the governance rules by various people, and what I call the collateral damage from other trials. So why is Adrenal different? The CTG has had vast experience with a number of large-scale trials, the SAFE, the CHEST, and the night sugar, and so on. The Adrenal is different because the enrollment criteria were more stringent. Number 1, we had to get a placebo, which was a powder, which wasn't easy, and it's a parenteral formulation. And because we were going to internationalize the trial, we had to have a GMP-licensed manufacturer of placebo, which allowed us to export the drugs and obviously the large patient numbers. So the trial, I actually thought about this trial in 1999, and I presented it at the hospital at a research meeting, and I was laughed at. So, and then I started applying in 2005. No. 6, no. 7, no. 8, no. 9, no. And so the only way is don't let the bastards grind you down. So in 2010 we got it from the NHMRC, and what was the difference? The Codicus added to the uncertainty at the time. 2, we had a better team. We had partnered with the George, and and there was a CTG survey at the time which showed that there was a hunger to answer this question, that people were prepared to withhold steroids, and especially after the Adrenal and the Codicus trials. And we had an endocrine theme for our college meeting, which really reinforced the whole idea at the time. And so we did a CTG survey, and essentially most people said, yes, we will do it. We're happy to use the Adrenal criteria. We would enroll patients to into septic shock, and we will withhold steroids, and we don't have to do the corticotropin test. So there are a number of other challenges. Well, obviously, there's equipoise issues. The other thing was the declining mortality in septic shock. So the mortality in the control arm in the Adrenal study was 63%. And clearly, mortalities were nowhere high at the time when we were looking at the trial. And then we had no clarity on the timing of steroids, the duration of steroids, whether you wean, whether you taper them, whether you don't taper them, and should or should we not be doing the corticotropin test. And obviously, we had to make sure that etomidate, Australia was etomidate-free, but New Zealand still had access to etomidate at the time. And this is just the mortality in septic shock that I told you about in the various trials and how things have changed over a decade. So the grant was awarded in 2010, and we thought, okay, now we're all set to go. And little did I realize that our problems were just starting. So, and we got ethics submission and site expressions of interest, everything going by August, September 2011. The first problem was getting the placebo sorted. So it added 1.5 years to the study because we had to get a GMP licensed supplier. Blew the budget by $400,000. We hadn't thought that through at the time. We approached Pfizer, the company at the time, whether they would be able to supply us. We tried to source the companies which supplied the Codicus and the Adrenal studies. We approached companies in India and China. And we even thought of a blinding device, which would, how we could dissolve the solution attached to the IV drip. And obviously, the obvious choice is saline as a placebo, but the hydrocortisone comes as a powder. And if you look at the ANAN trial. That's the report that they had of what they had about placebo in the ANAN trial, that they were indiscernible from active treatments, and that's what they had in the Cordicus trial as well. We really couldn't get any more information about what the placebo was. So if hydrocortisone had been proven to be effective, and if all patients received hydrocortisone, the entire cost of a 7-day course of treatment for 3,800 patients would have been about $150,000. But now, 1,900 were getting hydrocortisone, that's $75,000. And for the placebo, to get the placebo for the other, the costs were up to $1.1 million, depending on which placebo that you were prepared to go with. So we had various options we looked at. And so, so finally, and the problem was then we said, okay, methylprednisolone has a lactose as a carrier agent, which is a white powder, so we can use lactose in that, and in the placebo vials. And we went to a compounding chemist, and the problem, of course, is they said, well, we can give the vials to you, but you can't export the drug outside of Australia. So we had to step away from them because compounding chemists are not GMP licensed. And the lactose led to frothing, and therefore the vials couldn't be, you couldn't blind it. So finally, we decided we'll just have empty vials. We will get a GMP manufacturer to get us the empty vials identical to the hydrocortisone ones. The first negotiation commenced in October 2011, and the drug was finally delivered in 2013. So 18 months to the, and then we had to work out the implications of putting it through an infusion line, and well, the ICU drugs will inactivate the hydrocortisone. So we actually had to do a mixing study to make sure that the hydrocortisone at the end of the infusion was, in fact, you can give the 100% delivery. So the lessons learned from placebo was that designing parental placebos are very difficult. They're not often reported in the literature on how they actually do it. And so we have given a detailed description in our supplementary appendix in the journal. The blinding is difficult, significant extra costs, and makes a big difference to timelines. The second challenge was getting the international team together. And we as you can see, we approached 8 countries to do this trial. And thanks to Andy and Anders and Yassine, we got it set up and running in 3 countries. Now, running pharmaceutical trials in Europe is we obviously, because we're getting the drug over, we had to go through the MHRA, and we had to make sure there's a GMP licensed facility. But as you can see there, there's what's called a QP process, a qualified person who had to inspect the facility of where the drug was being manufactured, and their budget was about £44,000 to carry out that exercise. And so the submissions, we have to go through the EMA and the UDRACT for Europe, and all this adds a substantial amount of time and paperwork. In India, we got ethics approved, but at that time there was a clampdown on pharmaceutical trials in India because the Indian government felt that drug companies were coming and doing trials in India and putting patients to harm. And so they demanded that, they said they introduced what's called a compensation rule. So if any patient had an adverse effect from taking part in a trial, which included mortality, of course, irrespective of whether you're in the treatment arm or the placebo arm, the patients had to be given a compensation. And they also mandated a video recording of consent. So clearly, we couldn't proceed with India. We had ethics approval in Ireland, but because of delays in governance and change of administrations in the hospital, we couldn't proceed with Ireland. We had ethics approval in Hong Kong, but we couldn't resolve the indemnity issues in Hong Kong. Competing trials in Canada, they were interested, but obviously there are a number of other competing trials, and the same with the US, the Mayo Clinic. Because of indemnity issues, we couldn't proceed with the US. Now, the third challenge was ethics. Ethics approvals. Now, we got the study approved. We have what's called multi-site ethics approvals. So one site in each state was sufficient at the time. New South Wales, we got it sorted. We got it sorted in Queensland. Queensland has one extra step, what is called the Public Health Act. So a patient can give consent to take part in a trial, or the next of kin can give consent for taking part in a trial. But that's only for the study drug. if you have to use the data, the chart data, and follow them up, you have to go one step further to get what's called the Public Health Act approval. But if your trial is deemed to be exempt by what's called the QCAT, the Civil Administration Tribunal in Queensland, then you actually don't need the public health approval. So that's the process we followed. And in the UK, we obviously, Andy handled all the ethics submissions in the UK, but the MHRA process took nearly 12 months. So at the end of 12 months, we really hadn't recruited any patient into the trial in the UK, and therefore we got a letter from the ethics committee to say, you haven't recruited anyone into the trial, so your ethics approval is off. So Andy wrote a series of emails and managed to get it all back together. And so the recruitment challenges continued. So, when you do the feasibility, and obviously people are enthusiastic and interested, and we worked out that based on our feasibility survey, that we can enroll 1 patient per fortnight per site. And at that time, these were the number of trials happening at the CTG. So on the top row is, I'm not sure if you can see it from there, on the top row is the years. So the purple, the first line is Adrenal, and the purple spans from 2010, the extreme left column, all the way up to 2017. So our trial, we started recruiting in 2013. That's the 4th column from the left. And you can see there, at that time, there were at least 7 or 8 of the competing trials. And as we approached 2015, there were about 15 competing trials happening at the CTG. So, and this, although they weren't all studying septic shock patients, but it's the same research coordinator who was enrolling patients into the trials. So the risk of trial fatigue happening at the time. The other thing was that we said mandating mechanical ventilation was inclusion criteria, and we allowed BiPAP, but in 2010, high-flow nasal prongs became very popular, and so people stopped using BiPAP. So the number of patients who we thought would be eligible for the trial obviously reduced. Then, of course, we had the local bureaucracy issues, and the first one was the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which they'd been exporting drugs. They were the ones who give us the license to export drugs to other parts of the world. And so they suddenly said, hold on, we have gone and looked back at your paperwork, and we had to apply every 12 months for a new export license to the overseas country. So when we went back for a second export to an overseas, they said, hold on, we've actually gone back and looked at your paperwork. I don't think you can export anymore. And then they said, in fact, you can't export beyond Sydney. You can only just export to New South Wales, possibly Queensland. And so we had to go through, and that took us about 2 months of to and froing between them, and we finally got that sorted. Then we had another trial called the SPICE trial, which was where we had to do the governance, the New South Wales Civil Administration Tribunal said that you can't have deferred consent, as in you enroll the patient and get consent later on in the context of a clinical trial, because it's not allowed in New South Wales, and therefore they applied that ruling to the SPICE trial when they applied to get that approval. And so when that ruling came out, people then felt, hold on, Adrenal is the same. So they were a bit reluctant to get approvals to get continued Adrenal in New South Wales, and New South Wales was the biggest recruiter for us. And so the trial had to be suspended for 6 months in New South Wales. There were substantial legal costs that the judge had to incur. A number of research coordinator jobs depend on the per patient payment. So if a trial doesn't happen, a number of research coordinator jobs are threatened. Obviously, the morale, and it puts doubts in people's minds whether the trial will actually get completed. And then I told you about the Public Health Act, which was a Queensland requirement. And so 3 years into the trial, a person in the governance office said, hold on, but I have not actually seen a Public Health Act waiver in your application, although we had the QCAT exemption. And they said no, so we have to stop the trial. So the trial got stopped in Queensland 3 years into its duration. So it low recruitment by 2 months in Queensland. And then obviously there are always challenges adhering to the protocol, and people want to give steroids, people want to unblind the trial, and then there are always competing trials. There are other sepsis trials which come up. There are other CTG trials I told you about. There are pharmaceutical trials which happen, which obviously are more attractive because the per patient payments are substantial. And so we then we ran out of funding, so we had to apply to the NHMRC to get a top-up funding, which we got. And it's important to keep sites engaged and avoid trial fatigue. So I had most of the trial investigators' mobiles on my email, and so the weekend is the time that you miss patients, so I used to send them a text on the weekends just to keep Adrenal in mind. And the project management team, we let people know about milestones, newsletters, and it takes a lot of your personal time. You use up your long service leave and other leaves and unpaid time and so on. And you're really on call 24/7 for the duration of the trial. So after all this, Adrenal, we managed to finish the trial in 4 years and 1 month. It completed enrollment on the 21st of April. And as I mentioned to you, an email went out after every enrollment, and the comparative timelines, which I showed you before. And it's important to know the enrollment by region, and I think that you can see here nearly 20% of the cohort was enrolled by our international collaborators. And that shortened the duration of the trial by almost 1 year, apart from increasing the external validity of the trial. And also, we are doing a genetic sub-study of the Adrenal trial, and some of the UK sites contributed to that in a big way. And within ANZ, it's interesting that we always go to the teaching hospitals thinking that their enrollment will be maximal, but in fact, that's not always the case. So the tertiary centers only enroll 60%. The non-tertiary centers enrolled about 40% of the patients within ANZ. And finally, will a study like this fund a research coordinator? So the PA hospital where I work enrolled the highest number, 260 patients. And at $500 was a per patient payment, so the total payment they received for the Adrenal was $130,000, which really covers the cost of a 1.5 FTE for 1 year. That's all it covers. So, and that's the entire amount they got over the entire 4-year period. And from our perspective, this is Parissa, the manager of the George Institute. She gave us this information, what it actually costs to run the Adrenal trial. So the per patient payment was about, the per patient cost was actually $1,300. And so multiplied by 3,800, it comes close to $5 million. So that was the actual cost of running Adrenal, which is obviously significant, but nothing compared to what other trials cost. So to run a 3,800 patient trial for $5 million is a massive feat. So what's required is patience, persistence, and I think it's very important to engage with people, and you have to be communicating with them all the time, deal with frustrations, thick skin. Speaking of skin and the ectoderm, I didn't have much hair before I started. I certainly have none left now. And you work with people because people are working for you, and that's the thing that you've got to remember all the time. And you've got to work with your colleagues and have a good team. And I just put up the slide again. The study dates are important because the last enrollment was in April. The database was locked in October, and a manuscript was done within 4 weeks and was submitted to the journal. So, and I think that sort of a thing really takes we had a fantastic statistical team, obviously a terrific management committee, and superb support of the George. And, the project manager, Dorlin, was an unflappable person. She was able to work through every single obstacle all the way through. And the entire team of research coordinators, so the superb team of the George, thank you.
One of the very trendy words at the moment in training is resilience, and I think that is absolutely a word that is required for what you've had to do to get through this. Any of you who felt like getting into academic intensive care, you've probably all given up by now, because it's clearly a very big mountain to climb, and I think that really the results of the trial are worth the amount of effort you've put in. So thank you very, very much. Thank you to all of our speakers. I think we've had a really, really interesting morning. I'm sure that you'll want to collar them all over coffee. Coffee is served in the 2 rooms on either side, where the TradeX also is. Please speak to the trade people. They help to make the meeting run. We couldn't get people flying such a long way, very expensive, if we didn't have some support from the industry. So please do talk to them. So thank you once again to Bala for a fantastic study, Kathy for a great analysis of the paper, and for all of the rest of our review group on the stage here. Thank you very much.